Hello, I'm Nicholas Coley with Alex Merritt from Sweet Georgia Sports, and today we are going to preview the SEC Championship game, which takes place on Saturday in Atlanta. So we're going to get right into it, and we're going to discuss some background information. So I'm going to swing it to Alex to get things started.
All right. Thanks, Nick. It's been a while since we've done this. It's good to be back on the grind. But to preview this game, this is the juggernaut fight that college football fans have been expecting all season. This is a game that was kind of pinned down in August as the SEC championship matchup, and it ended up coming to fruition that way as both Georgia and Alabama won their respective divisions in a dominating fashion, especially on Alabama's part. Alabama has been dominant all season. They've shown no signs of weakness. They've shown signs of vulnerability, but they've been dominant for the better part of their season. And turning to Georgia, they've been up and down a little bit. They were inconsistent up until the LSU game. They dropped a bomb against LSU, and we can talk about that a little later. But since that LSU game, Georgia has been just as dominant as Alabama has. They've defeated multiple ranked teams. Florida, Kentucky, Auburn was even ranked when Georgia played them. And they had a dominant showing against Georgia Tech. And Jake Fromm has been a big part of that. A lot of people doubted Jake Fromm this year, especially at the beginning of the season with Justin Fields joining the team. And Jake Fromm was a little inconsistent as well up until the LSU game. But since the LSU game, like I said, Jake Fromm, the entire offense has been dominating their competition. And a lot of that also has to do with DeAndre Swift and Elijah Holyfield. Both are amazing running backs. And going back to Alabama, looking at Tua Tagovailoa in the season he's had, in my opinion, he's winning the Heisman Trophy. And we'll talk a little more about that later, but this is probably the game of the year in terms of regular season / conference championships.
Definitely, and I wanted to hit on that thing you said about Jake Fromm, who, to me, he's really cemented himself into that starting role for Georgia. We all knew Jake Fromm was a good quarterback coming in. He was a five-star guy. But, last season he really played a game manager type role for Georgia. I don't think anybody will deny that. But this year, like Tua, they both have come on and really proven themselves to be amongst the elite college quarterbacks. And while Tua is on a completely different level than anybody else, Jake Fromm is still a top 5, top 6 guy in college football. So we're going to hit some key matchups now. The first key matchup we want to talk about is Bama's defensive line versus Georgia's offensive line. So I'm going to swing it back to Alex.
So as you said, Nick, I think this is one of the two bigger matchups in this game. And both of these matchups fall onto the line of scrimmage. And as we all say, games are decided at the line of scrimmage. And I think one of the bigger ones in this case is, like you said, Alabama's defensive line versus Georgia's offensive line. Georgia's offensive line this season has been elite, as has Alabama's, and we'll get to that later. But Georgia's offensive line this season has been very good, and it's a very young offensive line, too. There's only one upperclassman starting on that offensive line right now. And I think when you look at the statistics, Alabama, the run defense, it ranks top 15 in college, which is a very good ranking. However, Alabama fans are used to a little more efficiency in that category, and I think given how dominant Georgia's their run offense has been the last month or so, and the whole season in general, they run the ball pretty well. I think that'll be a very key matchup, and I think that's something that Alabama should be concerned about because Georgia has been running the ball so well the last 3 or 4 games, and their offensive line, to complement that, is also very good. So when it stacks up against a defensive line like Alabama's, while they're very good, I think Alabama will have to scheme against that Georgia run offense.
Yeah, Swift and Holyfield they're elite running backs. They're arguably the best running back tandem in the country. And I am of the belief that those two guys can run on anybody just because, I mean, when you look at Swift and the things he can do, the way he moves in Holyfield, the things he can do, and how strong he is, there's no stopping those guys if they're put in the right position. The the issue may be is Chaney and Georgia's offensive team going to give Holyfield and Swift the opportunities they need, because we have seen in the past with this Georgia team that they get away from the run, and that's not always a winning scenario for them. So we're going to get into our other key matchup, and that'll be Bama's offensive line versus Georgia's defensive line, and I'm going to swing it back to Alex.
So another key matchup, again on the line of scrimmage, it kind of flip-flops to the other side of things. It's Alabama's offensive line against Georgia's defensive line. Because for me, I go to UGA, I'm a UGA fan, so naturally I watch all of their games. And to me, the defensive line is probably the weakest part of the team, at least in terms of consistency. Georgia had their best game, at least on the defensive line. They had their best game against Georgia Tech, which is impressive because Georgia Tech's rushing offense is up there, at least in stats. I believe actually they rank first in rushing yards per game. And they had an amazing game against Georgia Tech, both when they passed the ball and in the rushing game, which is good because assignment football against a triple option team like that shows a lot of discipline, especially for a defense as young as Georgia's. So I think that's something to note. But going to Alabama's offensive line, I believe they're just as good as Georgia. It matches up well, or they compare well at least. And Alabama's rush offense, similar to the rush defense, they're not as efficient as they normally are, which it's kind of a give or take because Alabama passes the ball so well. They don't need to run the ball as well. So I'm not taking that into too much consideration. But if Georgia can't generate pressure in this game, it's going to be a long day for Georgia. Georgia ranks last in the SEC in sacks. In Alabama, I believe they've only given up 9 sacks all season. And while it's not all about sacks, Georgia needs to find a way to generate consistent pressure or just disrupt the timing for Tua Tagovailoa and his throws. Because if Tua is just sitting back taking all the time he needs, he's going to pick apart that secondary like nobody else. So if Georgia doesn't find a way to generate pressure, it's going to be a long day for the Bulldogs.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with you there. Anybody that has watched Tua play at all this year has seen when he has time, he's unstoppable. And when he is under pressure, which is rare, he has become down to earth a little bit. But with Georgia struggles getting a consistent pass rush, you have to wonder how badly will that affect them in this game. But another matchup that we both found interesting is Georgia's defensive backs versus Alabama's wide receivers. So I'm going to give it back to Alex and let's hear his take on that.
So this is another interesting matchup to me because it kind of goes back to Georgia's defensive line because Georgia's secondary statistically and on paper is very good. You have arguably the best cornerback in college football, up there with Greedy Williams and Julian Love from Notre Dame, and DeAndre Baker. He is a finalist for the Jim Thorpe Award, along with those other 2 guys I mentioned. He's going to be a first-round pick, barring injuries or something. He's very likely to be a first-round pick in this upcoming NFL draft. And you also have guys like Tyreek McGee, Tyson Campbell, William Poole, and you have amazing safeties with J.R. Reed and Richard LeCounte. So on paper and statistically, they performed very well this season. However, if Georgia can't generate any pressure on Tua, that's not going to matter, especially when you consider the talent that Alabama has at wide receiver. In my opinion, they have the deepest wide receiving core and the best wide receiving core in college football. You look at guys like Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs III, Devontae Smith, and even the freshman Jalen Waddle. He's been playing well when he's on the. It'll be a very interesting matchup because if Georgia can generate pressure and disrupt Tua's timing a little bit, I think that can have a big effect on the way that Georgia's secondary plays. It gives them less time to cover their wide receivers, maybe gives a chance to generate some turnovers. And I think ultimately, given the efficiency of Alabama's passing offense, it'll make a big difference in this game.
Yeah, this Alabama team, they're scary defensively, and their defense has always been a trademark for them, especially since Nick Saban has been there. But recently, especially this year, their offense has just been insanely good. And this may be the first Bama team that has had an offense this good combined with a defense this good. And they're a scary team. And that's not to discredit Georgia at all, because Georgia is a scary team as well. And when we look at this SEC championship, we're probably talking about the two best teams in the country. And I don't think very many people would argue. You could say Clemson's a better team. You could say Notre Dame's a better team. I don't personally think they are, but I do think this matchup, this SEC championship, this is a matchup with the two best teams in the country, if you ask me. But
and just to kind of
okay, no, you're good.
Just to add on to that, I think Georgia, in terms of comparing to other teams that are in the top 6 or 7, I'm going to cut it off at Michigan because let's be honest, and I don't want to start a whole debate here, but UCF is not going to beat anybody that's ranked above them right now. Heck, I think even teams ranked below them could beat UCF, but that's a discussion for another day. But if you compare Georgia to teams like Michigan, Clemson, Notre Dame, like you were saying, I think Georgia stacks up pretty well against almost anybody in that top 7.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably take Georgia against every other team in the country besides Alabama, at least right now. And I would even take them against Alabama as one of the only teams that I think can actually beat Alabama. But we're going to move away from some matchups right now. We're going to dive into some statistics. And I know Alex has some of these statistics written down, so I'm going to give it right back to him.
So some statistics I want to look at here, and this kind of goes back to the matchups we were talking about earlier. I think this will give a better idea of how Georgia and Alabama compare in those categories. I was talking about Alabama's defensive line compared to Georgia's. Alabama ranks 5th in the nation in sacks. And they also rank very high in tackles for loss as well, while Georgia, in terms of sacks, they rank last in the SEC, which, as we were talking about earlier, that's a big concern for Georgia. I think that might be the biggest mismatch in this game is the lack of consistent pass rush from Georgia. And like I said before, it's not always about sacks, but sacks is definitely the easiest indicator in terms of defensive line's production. And Georgia, at least based on what I've seen, they don't blitz too often, but when they do, they're typically pretty effective. So I'm really interested to see what kind of blitz packages Georgia comes up with to make up for that lack of production in sacks. Another stat I want to look at real quick, and I think this is the biggest criticism for Alabama this season is their strength of schedule. According to a ranking SB Nation, and this ranking took a lot of factors into consideration. They took resumes, they took strength of record into consideration. They ranked Alabama and Georgia around the same. They ranked Alabama 35th and they ranked Georgia 33rd. And I know a lot of people say that Alabama doesn't play anybody, and some people say the same thing about Georgia. If you ask me, I'm not to be biased, but I think Georgia has a bit of a better strength of record. They do have a couple common opponents like Missouri and LSU. I think that's another discussion, but I do think throwing the strength of schedule thing out there is a little irrelevant considering they rank around the same. And they even compared, when you compare these rankings to other teams like Notre Dame or Clemson, it's not even close. Clemson actually ranks closer to UCF in terms of strength of schedule than they do to Alabama or Georgia. Again, that's probably another topic to talk about later on, but strength of schedule is really irrelevant because they have a couple common opponents and they play relatively the same strength of schedule. One more thing I want to look at is Georgia's rushing offense. If you look at DeAndre Swift and Elijah Holyfield, they both rank top 15 in yards per carry. DeAndre Swift averages close to 7 yards per carry, I believe, and Elijah Holyfield is around 6.7 or 6.6, somewhere around there, which are elite numbers, especially, given the fact that Georgia's running back depth chart is very deep, and it tipped Georgia and they're one of those teams that they always have great running backs, kind of like what you said with Alabama's defensive line. You just can't imagine a Georgia team that doesn't have good running backs. And it blows my mind even more the production they've had on the ground this year, given that they lost 2 of the best running backs in school history with Nick Chubb and Sony Michel. I couldn't go this video without saying both of their names, so I finally got it done. But I think that's a big thing to look at. I talked about Alabama's run defense, and it's a good run defense, but is it enough to stop Georgia's running game? Because Georgia's running game is elite this year, and really no one has stopped them yet.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned Nick Chubb and Sony Michel, because the defensive coordinator for Georgia Tech, Nate Woody, had to play against those guys when he was the defensive coordinator for App State 2 years ago. And when he was asked about how does he change his game prep for DeAndre Swift and Elijah Holyfield, he said there really is no difference. He said these guys are just as good. So now that we've kind of discussed some matchups, we've discussed some statistics, we want to talk about, if Georgia loses this game in a competitive way, do they still deserve a playoff spot over an Oklahoma team or an Ohio State team that wins their conference champions? I'm going to give my take on that, but first I'm going to let Alex give his take on it.
So this is a very interesting conversation. This really wasn't being talked about until Kirk Herbstreit brought this up yesterday or on Monday, I believe. This is being recorded on Wednesday. I think it's an interesting conversation, but I'm not sure how Georgia has a chance when they're compared to 2 Power 5 conference champions. Now, one thing I will add is when you compare the conference championship slate this year, Alabama's playing Georgia. That's definitely the matchup of the week. Oklahoma is playing Texas, and Texas is in that 9, 10, 11 range, I believe. And then Ohio State is playing Northwestern, who's in the top 20. But in my opinion, I don't think Northwestern should be ranked. That might be an unpopular opinion, but I don't think Northwestern is as good as their ranking suggests. But at the same time, it's really weird. I'm going to kind of go off topic a little bit because the rankings this year, they include a lot of 3 and 4 loss teams, and I think there's even a 5 loss team that's ranked. But a lot of college football teams this year are very mediocre, and because of that, it's very top heavy. So you have teams like Alabama, Georgia, Clemson, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Oklahoma, those kinds of teams. But after that, once you get past that elite tier, or at least very good to elite tier, it kind of falls off a lot. And that's why you're seeing a lot of teams like Missouri just got ranked and they're a 4-loss team, or God only knows how Texas A&M has stayed ranked this entire season, although they didn't have that amazing game against LSU. But that's besides the point. I just think that the rankings this year are a little skewed because a lot of college football teams are average this year, at least compared to years past. And I think, again, that's another conversation we can have another day. Again, I don't think Northwestern should be ranked as high as they are, if at all. So when you compare the opponents of the conference championship slate, Georgia, in my opinion, is a top 4 team. But because they play in the SEC, they have to play Alabama the week before the playoff committee selects the playoff teams. So it's going to be interesting. To give you an answer, I don't think they have a shot. Again, it depends on the context of the game, and it depends on what Oklahoma and Ohio State. But if I had to give an answer right now, I'd say no, they don't have a great shot if they lose to Alabama.
I'm going to agree with you. They don't have a shot. I will say, I'm going to go out on a limb and say they might deserve it, though, just because when I have watched Oklahoma games, they have an incredible offense. I think their offense could probably score on any defense in the country, but their defense is they're terrible, and there's really no other way to describe that. And if, the committee, they want to talk about complete teams and how complete teams deserve a shot, Georgia is a much more complete team than Oklahoma right now. And then when I look at Ohio State, I have watched, quite a few Ohio State games this year because they're on TV every week. I mean, they're on a national time slot almost every week as well. While I do think Dwayne Haskins is an incredible college quarterback, I don't think Ohio State as a team is very good. They had that terrible loss to Purdue where they lost by 29 points. I think that's kind of inexcusable. And I know they finished strong against Michigan, but Michigan is a very choky team. And I think they too were overrated. Harbaugh has, overall been a disappointment, but that's not really what the topic is here. So, I think Georgia, if you ask me any given day, I would take Georgia over Ohio State and Oklahoma because I think they're just a better team all around. But, a two-loss Georgia team, do they deserve it over a two-loss conference champion? Does a two-loss Georgia team deserve it over Ohio State or Oklahoma? Yes, I think they do, just because if we're going by standards of a complete team, yeah, I would take Georgia. Will the committee do that? No, because one, they don't want a rematch between Alabama and Georgia for the first playoff game. Two, I think conference championships, they should matter, even though they don't always seem to matter. And that's the thing with the committee. These rules they throw out are very confusing. They seem to change from year to year and week to week. So I'm gonna, like I said, Georgia doesn't have a shot because they just don't. If all things were fair and all things were right in the world, I think Georgia should definitely get in. And that may be a hot take to some people. I don't think it is. I just think Georgia's a better team. And if it's a competitive loss, then that means Georgia is, just as good or not, very close to Alabama. If it's a blowout, then obviously not. But yeah, so that's our takes on that. There's another thing we did want to discuss since this is a Georgia related conversation. We wanted to talk about Georgia Tech firing Paul Johnson. So I'm going to swing it to Alex to hear his take on that, and then I'll give my take on it after him.
So this is Paul Johnson's retirement happened right before we started recording this, and we thought we'd throw this in. Like Nick said, this is something that pertains to Georgia because I think there's a lot of different things that Georgia Tech can do here because, yes, Paul Johnson ran that triple option for a long time at Georgia Tech, and that offense and that roster is built to run that offense. So, in my opinion, there's two different routes we can go here. We can hire someone, or not we, I mean Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech can hire someone that runs the option, and they can keep running the option, and they wouldn't have to go through that transition period. The other route they can go, which I think they should do, they should go ahead and just make that transition because it's an inevitable transition. It's going to take a couple of years to get recruits and to get the right personnel for a non-option offense, which I think would be more competitive, especially when you're playing a team like Georgia or Clemson or anybody in Georgia Tech's. Although they do have Virginia Tech's numbers, so I'll give them that. But as someone that's not as informed on Georgia Tech, that's my take. I think they should hire someone, maybe a young gun offensive coordinator, run some type of, something similar to Auburn's offense or Clemson's offense or even a Big 12 type offense just to compensate for the lack of talent they have from a personnel standpoint, at least. That's my take. I think there's a lot of options. That Gus Malzahn rumor circulating, so we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and I'm actually a Georgia Tech fan. I probably started watching college football around the same time Paul Johnson was hired. So I've definitely seen the heights of this offense, back in the day with Josh Nesbitt, Jonathan Dwyer, and Demarius Thomas. And that team went to a Chick-fil-A Bowl. They got, destroyed by LSU, but that was a hype for Georgia Tech, and in a couple years ago, they in 2014, I believe they lost in the ACC championship by 2 points to a Jameis Winston Florida State team, and then they went on to win an Orange Bowl against Mississippi State that nobody expected. Nobody thought they would win that game, but they won it, and they actually did win an ACC championship against Clemson, I believe. That victory was vacated, so it's not in the record books, but it still happened. Paul Johnson, he was at Georgia Tech for 11 seasons. He had an incredible tenure. I think he peaked at the program maybe 2 or 3 seasons ago, but they kept holding on to him, and I can't speak for why. But they do, they hired a new athletic director, Todd Stansbury, a couple of years ago, who has been trying to bring Georgia Tech to a more competitive level athletically. They've invested in the new weight rooms. I think they're spending around $30 million on their athletic programs in general. So they're really trying to bring themselves up as a program. Now, as far as a replacement for Paul Johnson, I've already seen a few names thrown around. Brian Bonahan, the KSU coach, Kennesaw State, not the Kansas KSU, but the Kennesaw State coach. You've seen Stratterfield, the App State coach. Personally, I wouldn't mind a Stratterfield hire during a transition period because App State doesn't run a true option. They kind of run a power run offense that can throw the ball. I think that would be a good offense to start transitioning Tech away from that option. Personally, I want to see a coach who is willing to come in and help rebuild the team in general. There's so many names out there. I know Gus Malzahn, that I've seen that rumor circulating, like you said. I wouldn't mind a Gus Malzahn hire. I know he's kind of worn out his welcome at Auburn. I know he has made some absolutely boneheaded decisions while coaching there. But I think he may have peaked in the SEC and in that conference in general. And he just might not be able to beat teams like Alabama. If he came to Georgia Tech, while he would have to face Clemson and Georgia twice a year, I think, considering some of the other teams that he would have to play yearly, like, Pitt and Miami and those other ACC Coastal teams, I think Gus would walk right through the ACC Coastal and win. And Georgia Tech would probably only be losing around, a couple games a year, and there may be a couple surprises. And I think Gus runs an offense that could also slowly help Tech transition because Auburn loves to run the ball. When they haven't had a quarterback who can, be an effective passer since Cam Newton, arguably. So I think Gus would be a good hire for Tech. I think any offensive coordinator who kind of has an innovative offense. I know the spread offense it's been very big in college recently. I don't know if Georgia Tech would go after a guy like Cliff Kingsbury though. And I know Mike Leach, his name has been thrown around. I think Georgia Tech has a lot of options. I don't have a certain name though. I just want them to hire a guy who can kind of slowly transition them away from the option offense they run. Nothing against the option offense. Is the fact that Paul Johnson was as successful with it at this level of college football speaks volumes. But I just think it's not the move going forward. But other than that, that's both our takes on the Paul Johnson scenario and his retirement. He deserves a lot of credit for what he did and for the few times he was able to beat Georgia, which wasn't very often. I think um, 2 or 3 times he actually did it.
Yeah.
So
Paul Johnson was 3-8 against Georgia.
yeah, I mean 3-8, and 2 of those wins came in Athens within the last 4 years. So not too bad. He definitely has some talent at Georgia Tech. He sent a couple guys to the NFL on the offensive line. he sent a couple wide receivers to the NFL. Demaryius Thomas is really the only one who carved out a successful career though. But we're gonna wrap this video up unless you have anything else to say.
We need to do score predictions
Oh
for
yeah,
this SEC championship to
definitely.
close this out. So right at least last time I checked, the spread for the SEC championship it was 13.5 points, which I think speaks volumes to how Vegas values Georgia, at least comparing them to Alabama. And Alabama has their closest game has been 22 points, which was against Texas A&M early on in the season. I think Georgia could very easily, not very easily, but I think they are very capable of covering that spread. If I had to give a score prediction, I do think Georgia has a good shot, the best shot of any team Alabama has played this year. I think Georgia has the best shot to beat Alabama. Do have them losing this game. I'm going to give it a 40-34 type game for Alabama, but I could very easily see that flip in favor of Georgia.
Yeah. So I haven't really been thinking about a score prediction, but as we've talked throughout this video, and as I've started to get a better idea of who Alabama is as a team, and I've watched every Georgia game pretty much this year, I'm gonna go out and say that Alabama will be able to score around 35 points. I think Georgia can score that many points as well, but considering some of their slow starts, that really concerns me. So I'm gonna go 35 Alabama and 24 Georgia, just because I don't think Georgia will be able to score as quickly as they would like to. Now, Alabama is just a better team. And I do think it'll be a competitive game, but I think Alabama is really just going to open up those floodgates in Georgia. Once they have to start throwing the ball a lot, it hasn't proven to turn out well for them. But that's all that we have for you guys. Thank you for listening. And I know both of us had a little rust at times. We're sorry for that. But I'm Nicholas Coley. This with Alex Merritt for Sweet Georgia Sports, and hopefully we can try to make some more videos for you guys. Thank you.